Close your eyes and let your thoughts drift gently across the quiet waves of time. Tonight, we journey to a land of green fields, stone churches, and timeless meadows. A place where history rests beneath the soil and speaks softly through ruined castles and ancient abbeys. This is the story of medieval England, a 1,000-year tale carved in parchment and whispered through cathedral vaults. From misty beginnings in the early Middle Ages to the twilight of the Tudor dynasty, England's medieval story unfolds like a slow-moving tapestry, stitched by kings and queens, monks and peasants, warriors and poets. It is a story of conquest and continuity, of spiritual devotion and feudal bonds, of the Black Death and the flowering of the English tongue. And tonight, as sleep embraces your senses, you will drift with it. We begin not with the clash of swords, but with quiet settlement, the coming of the Anglo-Saxons. These early Germanic peoples arrived not as conquerors, but as migrants. From their wooden halls rose the earliest forms of English law, poetry, and community. As the centuries passed, new rulers would come: the Norse, the Normans, and later the Plantagenets. Each left a mark, and each layered a new chapter onto the island's soul. This script is written for your rest, your peace, and your deep learning. You may drift off as we travel together, and that's perfectly welcome. The pace will remain gentle, the narration soft and unhurried, and at each moment you are free to rest, to sleep, to dream. You will hear of village life and royal intrigue, the clatter of hooves on cobbled roads, the Latin chants of monastic choirs, the building of castles, and the slow toll of cathedral bells. We will journey through the Black Death and the 100 Years' War, through the rise of English common law and the flowering of literature in Chaucer's voice. And in the final chapters, we'll see the sun set on the medieval world as the Tudors bring new winds of change. But this is not a tale of battles alone. It is a portrait of everyday life, how people lived, prayed, ate, and dreamed. You'll walk beside shepherds tending flocks on the downs, watch a mason carving limestone beneath the rose window of a great church, and sit quietly by the hearth of a thatched village home. The style, as always with the Quiet Conquest, is calm, reflective, and built for bedtime. We'll pause often for gentle transitions. We'll explain terms as we go, softly and clearly. If you find yourself drifting into sleep, the story will continue, like the quiet turning of pages in a candlelit chamber. So let your breathing deepen, let your body settle into stillness, and let your mind become a vessel for the soft unfolding of history. As the moonlight falls across the fields of memory, we begin with the dawn of Anglo-Saxon England. As we begin our journey, the Roman legions have long since departed from Britain. The roads they laid remain, worn and mossy. Their villas crumble in the countryside. It is the 5th century, and a new chapter begins. In the wake of Rome's retreat, various tribes from across the sea begin to settle along Britain's shores. These are the Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples from regions that we now call Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Among them are the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes. They come not in great conquering hordes, but gradually, over generations seeking new homes, farming land, and a future. Picture it now, a quiet clearing in the forest. A small timber hall rises at its center, smoke curling gently from its hearth. Around it are fields of barley and wheat. The people here live close to the land. They plow with wooden tools, tend to livestock, and weave wool into cloaks. Their world is local, kin-based, and rooted in custom. Anglo-Saxon England is not a unified kingdom, but a patchwork of small kingdoms: East Anglia, Mercia, Wessex, Northumbria, Kent. These realms often war with one another, but they also share language and culture. The language they speak is Old English, a sturdy and poetic tongue. Much of it survives in today's English, in words like strong, earth, and home. Their beliefs are shaped by pagan gods Odin, Thor, and others, but soon a quiet revolution begins. Christian missionaries, particularly from Ireland and Rome, arrive with new words, new symbols, and new rhythms of life. In 597 AD, St. Augustine of Canterbury arrives in Kent, sent by the Pope to convert the English. He is welcomed by King Ethelbert, and soon a church is founded in Canterbury, a city that will remain sacred for centuries. Monasteries begin to rise places of learning, prayer, and sanctuary. Picture the monastery at Lindisfarne, off the northern coast. It stands as a beacon of early Christian life, where monks in woolen robes copy texts by hand, illuminate manuscripts, and chant psalms in the flickering candlelight. One of the most famous works from this era is Beowulf, an epic poem told in alliterative verse. It tells of heroes and monsters, of courage and loyalty. Though mythic, it reflects real Anglo-Saxon values: honor, kinship, and a deep awareness of fate. As the centuries roll forward, certain kings begin to stand out, among them Alfred the Great. Ruling Wessex in the late 9th century, Alfred is both warrior and scholar. He defends his realm from the Norse invaders, the Vikings who have begun to raid England's coasts and rivers. But Alfred is also a builder. He establishes schools, translates Latin texts into English, and dreams of a united kingdom. By the 10th century, that dream begins to take shape. England, as a single realm, slowly emerges under the House of Wessex. Kings like Edgar the Peaceful and Ethelred, the unready reign from Winchester, issuing charters and laws. Towns begin to grow, trade expands, coinage becomes standardized. The land is stitched together by oath and duty. But peace is always fleeting. The Vikings return, and with them comes the great Dane, King Cnut. In 1016, he takes the throne of England, and for a brief time the kingdom is part of a North Sea empire. Yet beneath the thrones and treaties, life continues quietly for most. A village woman tends her herbs. A shepherd watches the stars. A blacksmith shapes iron in a smoky forge. The rhythms of life are slow, seasonal, and sacred. Architecture reflects this world: wooden halls with thatched roofs, earthwork fortifications, and stone churches with narrow windows. The scent of peat fires and beeswax fills the air. Meals are simple: bread, ale, cheese, pottage. By the mid-11th century, one man holds the crown: Edward the Confessor. Pious and reserved, Edward rules from Westminster, where he builds a great stone church, Westminster Abbey. It is Romanesque in style, with thick walls and rounded arches. A symbol of both faith and monarchy, it will become the resting place of kings. But Edward leaves no heir, and with his death in 1066, the ground begins to shift beneath England's feet. 3 men claim the throne. Among them is Harold Godwinson, the last Anglo-Saxon king. His reign will last just 9 months. Across the Channel in Normandy, a powerful duke watches closely. His name is William, and soon, with sails raised and armor gleaming, he will cross the sea. But for now, we rest with the Anglo-Saxons in their quiet fields and carved stones. Their language, their poetry, and their laws will echo through English history for centuries to come. As we close this chapter, let your thoughts drift like smoke from a hearth, through forest paths and monastic cloisters, through carved runes and sacred hymns. The age of the Normans awaits. The year is 1066, a year of omens and upheaval. With the death of King Edward the Confessor, the question of succession tears through the English kingdom like a chill wind. Competing claims rise, and among them stands Harold Godwinson, a nobleman of powerful lineage. Crowned king by the English lords, Harold takes up the weight of the crown. But across the English Channel, another man believes the throne is rightfully his. He is William, Duke of Normandy, a stern and calculating noble of Viking ancestry. William claims that Edward had promised him the crown, and that Harold had sworn a sacred oath to support him. In the autumn of that fateful year, William gathers an army, commissions ships, and sails from Normandy toward the southern coast of England. Imagine the scene. A fleet of ships crossing the churning sea, sails taut with wind, soldiers armored in mail, and horses tethered below deck. As they land at Pevensey, the Norman army begins to make camp, burning and foraging to sustain themselves. Word travels quickly, and Harold, fresh from defeating another rival in the north, rushes to meet them at Hastings. The Battle of Hastings unfolds on October 14th, 1066, a clash of shield walls, cavalry, and arrows. Harold fights bravely, but by day's end, he is struck down. Legend says an arrow pierces his eye, and his army crumbles. William emerges victorious, and by Christmas, he is crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Thus begins the Norman Conquest, and with it, a profound transformation. Though William brings fewer than 10,000 men, his influence reshapes the very fabric of English society. Let us pause here and imagine the landscape of change. The old Anglo-Saxon nobility is largely swept away, replaced by Norman lords loyal to the new king. Vast tracts of land are redistributed to these newcomers. A new class of ruling elite is born, speaking Norman French, building stone castles, and bringing with them the feudal system that defined much of medieval Europe. Feudalism, at its heart, is a pyramid of loyalty. The king sits at the top, granting land called fiefs to his barons. In return, they provide knights and soldiers. Those knights, in turn, oversee the peasants, who work the land and sustain the entire structure. This system is bound together not by written contracts, but by oaths of homage and fealty, sworn on holy relics or sacred texts. Daily life under this new system is still rooted in the land. Most people are serfs or villeins, bound to the estate, obligated to work certain days for their lord and to provide a portion of their crops. Yet they also retain small plots of land for their families. Life is hard, but communal, marked by festivals, feasts, and the cycle of the agricultural year. Castles rise across the countryside, initially in timber, then in stone. These are not just military fortresses, but centers of administration and power. Picture the Motte and Bailey Dzienin earthen mound topped with a wooden tower surrounded by a palisade and ditch. Over time, these evolve into massive stone structures like the Tower of London, begun under William's command. The Normans also transformed the legal and administrative systems. In 1086, William orders a sweeping survey of his kingdom, resulting in the creation of the Domesday Book. This remarkable document records landholdings, population, livestock, and a snapshot of an entire nation's economy. It is both a tool of taxation and a symbol of control. Religion, too, is reshaped. Norman bishops replace Anglo-Saxon ones. Great cathedrals are begun in Durham, Canterbury, Winchester, and beyond. Built in the Romanesque style, thick walls, rounded arches, and grand towers, these sacred spaces blend French artistry with English devotion. And through all this, language begins to shift. The ruling class speaks French, the clergy uses Latin, the common folk speak Old English. Over time, these tongues mix. French words for law, fashion, and cuisine enter the English vocabulary, words like court, robe, and feast. It is the beginning of the English language as we know it today. The monarchy continues with William's sons, first William Rufus, then Henry I. These are years of both stability and tension. The Normans consolidate their rule, build institutions, and refine the machinery of royal power. Yet challenges persist from rebellious nobles, rival claimants, and the ever-present threat of dynastic strife. A civil war erupts in the mid-12th century, known as the Anarchia, bitter struggle between Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I, and her cousin Stephen of Blois. The realm descends into chaos as castles become private fortresses and lawlessness spreads. Chroniclers describe the time as one when Christ and his saints slept. But from this turbulence rises a new dynasty, the Plantagenets, beginning with Henry II. His reign, which we will explore in the next chapter, brings both brilliance and conflict, legal reform, territorial expansion, and a tempestuous family legacy. As we prepare to leave this chapter, let us rest for a moment beside the hearth of a Norman manor. The stone walls are thick, the light soft through narrow windows. A hound sleeps at your feet. A fire crackles, warming the rush-covered floor. Outside, the world changes, but within, the rhythms of life remain. We have moved from the wooden halls of the Anglo-Saxons to the fortified castles of the Normans, from tribal loyalties to a feudal hierarchy, from English tongues to a tapestry of languages. And through it all, England becomes not just a place, but a kingdom layered with power, tradition, and quiet endurance. Let your thoughts wander across the tower walls, through the scent of wet stone and candle wax, and into dreams, for in the next chapter, a brilliant and complex king will take the stage, and with him, the heart of the medieval age. We now enter the high tide of the Middle Ages in England, a period of dazzling ambition, of law and language, of strife and splendor. The crown now rests upon the brow of Henry II, the first of the Plantagenet kings. His reign begins in 1154 and marks a new era of royal authority, legal reform, and continental entanglements. Henry is no ordinary monarch. Brilliant, driven, and mercurial, he rules not only England, but a vast swath of France, territories inherited through birth and marriage. His queen, Eleanor of Aquitaine, is equally remarkable, cultured, politically astute, and once married to the King of France before wedded to Henry. Together, they are the architects of a dynasty, but also of discord. Let us imagine the royal court under Henry. Stone halls echo with the footsteps of messengers. Scrolls are unrolled on carved oak tables. Legal scribes record the king's commands in Latin. His innovations in law shape the very structure of English justice. Under Henry, common law begins to take root, a system where royal judges travel the realm, hearing disputes and applying consistent rulings. He also introduces trial by jury, replacing older customs such as trial by ordeal. These changes, though quiet, plant the seeds of modern legal practice, of due process, precedent, and equity under law. Yet Henry's reign is not without turmoil. One of the most dramatic episodes centers on his close friend and later rival, Thomas Becket, whom Henry appoints as Archbishop of Canterbury. At first an ally, Becket transforms into a defender of church independence. Their conflict intensifies, until in 1170, 4 of Henry's knights, perhaps misunderstanding a frustrated command, murder Becket in his own cathedral. The news shocks Christendom. Pilgrims flock to Canterbury, where the blood-stained floor becomes a sacred site. Becket is canonized, and Henry, penitent, walks barefoot to the shrine. It is a moment that illustrates the fraught balance between crown and church, ambition and conscience. Henry and Eleanor's children prove no easier to manage. Among them is the fiery and charismatic Richard the Lionheart, who inherits the throne in 1889. Known more for his martial prowess than for governing, Richard spends most of his reign abroad leading the Third Crusade to the Holy Land. The Crusades are a defining feature of this era, a series of religious wars aimed at reclaiming Jerusalem. They draw thousands from across Europe, including English knights, pilgrims, and chroniclers. Though wrapped in the language of faith, the Crusades are also battles for glory, trade, and political power. Back in England, Richard's absence places a heavy burden on the realm. When he is captured and held for ransom, an enormous sum is demanded and paid by his subjects. His brother, John, rules in his stead, and upon Richard's death, becomes king. King John is remembered with infamy. His rule is marked by conflict, both with the nobility and with the church. He loses lands in France, raises taxes, and angers his barons. The tension culminates in 1215 at Runnymede, where John is forced to seal the Magna Carta, the Great Charter. the Magna Carta is a remarkable document. Though its original intent was narrow protecting the rights of feudal lords, it introduces enduring principles, that the king is not above the law, that justice should not be sold or denied, and that certain rights are guaranteed. Over the centuries, these ideas will echo through the English legal tradition and beyond. John's reign ends in bitterness, but the Plantagenet line continues. His son, Henry III, reigns for over 50 years, overseeing the construction of the Gothic Westminster Abbey, where pointed arches and ribbed vaults now lift the eye heavenward. It is a period of both grandeur and revolt, as barons once again rise against royal overreach. The next king, Edward I, is both warrior and administrator. He codifies laws, strengthens royal authority, and wages war against Wales and Scotland. His conquest of Wales is brutal, but lasting, symbolized by the great castles he erects at Caernarfon, Conwy, and Harlech. These are not just military outposts, but visual declarations of power. Edward also summons Parliament, calling together not just nobles and clergy, but commoners, knights, and burgesses from across the realm. Though limited at first, this practice lays the foundation for representative government. The notion that the king must consult the realm takes deeper root. Yet Edward's legacy is marred by tragedy. In 1290, he expels England's Jewish population, a cruel act of prejudice and greed, carried out with solemn finality. Jews had lived in England since the Norman era, serving in finance and trade, but centuries of scapegoating culminate in their forced exilion that would not be reversed for over 350 years. As the 14th century dawns, the world begins to shift. Edward's grandson, Edward III, leads England into the long and costly conflict known as the 100 Years' War, a topic we will explore more deeply in the next chapter. But for now, let us rest in the heart of this medieval age. Picture a town market on a spring morning. Wooden stalls line the muddy street. Bakers offer bread, weavers display dyed wool, children chase chickens between the stalls. A bell tolls from the parish church. Somewhere in the distance, a knight returns from a journey, his armor dusty from travel. This is a time of contrasts, castles and cottages, Latin scrolls and folk tales, kings who lead armies and kings who read psalms. The world is changing, but slowly, like stone warmed by the sun. As we prepare to leave this chapter, take a breath and let your mind wander through the vaulted nave of a cathedral. Listen to the echo of footsteps on worn flagstones. Smell the beeswax candles, the incense curling into sacred air. The walls whisper stories. The windows glow with saints and seasons. And above it all, the bells ring on calling us to the next age. The century opens with confidence. Under Edward III, England is prosperous, assertive, and proud. The king is tall, charismatic, and deeply committed to the ideals of chivalry. His court is filled with tournaments, poetry, and polished armor. But beneath the splendor lies tension, and the century will be marked by a series of deep shocks, some visible on the battlefield, others hidden in the breath of plague. Edward's claim to the French crown sparks a long and complex conflict, the 100 Years' War, which begins in 1337. At its core is a dynastic dispute, but it becomes much more, a prolonged struggle for prestige, territory, and trade. The war will wax and wane for over a century, shaping English identity in profound ways. Early victories come swiftly. In 1346, Edward's army defeats the French at Crécy, a battle famous for the deadly precision of the longbow, a powerful weapon drawn from English yew and capable of piercing armor from great distances. The longbow becomes the hallmark of English infantry, a symbol of peasant power in an age of knights. 10 years later, at Poitiers, Edward's son, the gallant Black Prince, captures the French king. England seems triumphant. Yet these victories, though dazzling, do not bring lasting peace. And then, without warning, comes the plague. In 1348, a ship arrives on England's southern coast, carrying a quiet terror. The Black Death, a deadly strain of bubonic plague, sweeps through towns and villages. It spreads by flea and breath, by contact and cargo. No one is spared, noble or serf, monk or merchant. Picture the empty lanes of a once bustling village, doors marked with crosses, carts bearing the dead, the air thick with incense, with fear. Bells toll in endless succession. Nearly half of England's population perishes in just a few short years. Entire families vanish. Fields go untilled. Monasteries lose their brothers. Children grow up alone. And yet, from this devastation, subtle shifts begin to stir. With so many gone, labor becomes scarce. Survivors can demand better wages. Serfs begin to leave their manors in search of freer lives. The old feudal bonds begin to fray. Parliament, concerned by rising wages, passes the Statute of Laborers, attempting to freeze pay and tie peasants to their lords. But the tide is turning. Religious disillusionment also deepens. The church, once the great source of solace, seems shaken by the plague. Some clergy flee, others die ministering to the sick. Mysticism, pilgrimage, and local faith movements gain ground. The English begin to question established authority, not just in the manor house, but in the pulpit. It is in this atmosphere, in 1381, that the Great Peasants' Revolt erupts. The immediate cause is a poll tax, levied on every individual regardless of wealth. But the deeper cause is a generation's worth of frustration over low wages, high rents, legal restrictions, and social contempt. Led by men like Wat Tyler and inspired by the preacher John Ball, thousands of peasants march toward London demanding reform. When Adam delved and Eve span, Ball declares, who was then the gentleman? Imagine them now, barefoot, determined, carrying farm tools and banners. As they pour into the capital, the young King Richard II, only 14 at the time, meets them at Smithfield. There, Wat Tyler is killed in a sudden scuffle, and the revolt collapses. The promises made to the rebels are soon revoked, yet the message remains. The age of unquestioned hierarchy is beginning to end. Richard II's reign remains troubled. Though crowned in childhood and initially popular, he grows increasingly autocratic. He surrounds himself with favorites, alienates his nobles, and struggles to maintain control. Eventually, he is deposed by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who becomes Henry IV, founding the Lancastrian branch of the Plantagenets. The transition is uneasy. The idea that kings could be removed not by God, but by Parliament and sword sets a powerful precedent. Rebellion simmers beneath the throne, and while kings rise and fall, England's culture deepens. This is the age of Geoffrey Chaucer, courtier and poet, who begins composing the Canterbury Tales. Written in Middle English, Chaucer's tales offer a portrait of medieval society, from knights to millers, prioresses to pardoners, all traveling together to the shrine of Thomas Becket in Canterbury. Let us pause here and picture their journey. The road winds through green countryside past hedgerows and churches. The pilgrims walk and ride, telling stories to pass the time, funny stories, moral stories, tales of wonder and sin. Chaucer's language, once strange, begins to feel familiar. His rhythms form the foundation of English literature. Another light of the age is Julian of Norwich, a mystic who survives the plague and experiences visions of divine love. She writes Revelations of Divine Love, the first known book in English by a woman. Her message, tender and radical, affirms that all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. By the late 14th century, England has been transformed by war, plague, and protest, yet its institutions endure. Parliament grows stronger, the law continues to evolve. A sense of Englishness rooted in language, memory, and shared suffering takes deeper root. The nobility, however, remains restless. Rival claims to the throne linger, and soon they will burst into civil war, a conflict not between nations, but within a single crown. As we close this chapter, imagine the quiet after the storm. The village returns to its rhythms. Children play beside the fields. A woman mends a tunic in the fading light. In the cathedral, the choir sings vespers beneath the rose window. History pauses, but does not sleep. We have passed through shadows and fire. And ahead, in the next chapter, we enter the storm of the Wars of the Roses, a time of roses and rival kings. The century turns again, and with it, the crown begins to wobble. The descendants of Edward III, though many, grow entangled in rival claims and dynastic ambition. Two branches of the royal family emerge as bitter rivals, the House of Lancaster, whose badge is a red rose, and the House of York, whose emblem is white. This conflict becomes known as the Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars and shifting allegiances that will plunge England into 3 decades of bloodshed, treachery, and political upheaval. The roots lie in the troubled reign of Henry VI, a gentle and devout man, but not suited for kingship. Crowned as a child, Henry grows into a pious and bookish ruler, more drawn to prayer than policy. Under his reign, England loses much of its French territory gained during the 100 Years' War. Discontent rises. His mental health deteriorates. Factions at court sharpen their knives. The Yorkist claim is led by Richard, Duke of York, a powerful noble with a strong line of descent. Though initially a loyal subject, Richard is eventually drawn into open conflict, asserting his right to influence or perhaps even possess the throne. The wars begin in 1455 at the First Battle of St. Albans. Over the next 30 years, England becomes a battlefield of lords, picture banners fluttering over green fields, heavy armor clashing under gray skies, archers loosing arrows through misty dawns, castles besieged, families divided, victory sways back and forth. At times, it seems the Lancastrians hold the crown firmly. At others, the Yorkists surge forward with unstoppable force. The turning point comes in 1461 when Richard's son, Edward IV, defeats Henry VI and claims the throne. Edward is young, handsome, and militarily capable. For a time, peace returns. But it is fragile. Edward's reign is marred by internal division, particularly with his former ally, Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker. When Edward marries Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, against Warwick's wishes, alliances crack. Warwick turns against Edward, restores Henry VI briefly, then dies in battle. The wheel turns again. Edward returns to the throne, ruling with greater strength until his death in 1483. Here, the shadows grow thicker. Edward's eldest son is still a boy. Edward Vand, the realm must be guided by a protector. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's brother. What follows remains one of the greatest mysteries of English history. Richard takes the crown for himself, becoming Richard III. The young king and his brother, known as the Princes in the Tower, vanish within the walls of the Tower of London. Whispers suggest murder, though the truth is never proven. Richard's reign is short, marked by suspicion and unease. And across the sea, a new claimant rises, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian with a thin but resolute claim. In 1485, he lands in Wales, gathers supporters, and marches to meet Richard in battle. That confrontation comes at Bosworth Field, a quiet rise of land in Leicestershire. On August 22nd, the two armies clash. Richard fights valiantly, charging into the fray in search of Henry himself, but betrayal among his allies seals his fate. Richard falls in battle. A horse, my kingdom for a horse. And with his death, the Plantagenet dynasty ends. Henry is crowned Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. To unite the warring factions, He marries Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. Red rose and white are joined in a new emblem, the Tudor rose. Thus the medieval age begins to fade, and something new begins to take form. But before we leave this chapter, let us pause and consider the effects of these civil wars. The power of the great nobles has been broken. Many once powerful houses lie in ruins. Castles are abandoned, armies shrink. The monarchy, once dependent on noble goodwill, now stands more centralized, more cautious, more commanding. Economically, the wars have limited impact on the peasantry compared to plague or taxation. Fields are still tilled, markets still operate. Life in villages continues, even as kings rise and fall. Culturally, the late 15th century sees a quiet flowering. Architecture continues to evolve. The perpendicular Gothic style reaches its zenith, vertical lines, grand windows, intricate tracery. Universities in Oxford and Cambridge expand. Printing presses soon arrive, spreading books beyond the cloister and court. The Tudors bring order, but also vigilance. Henry VII rules shrewdly, restoring the treasury, balancing power, and avoiding reckless wars. His court is subdued, but stable. It is the beginning of a new kind of monarchy-less feudal, more bureaucratic. As we close this chapter, let us walk through a quiet lane of Tudor London. The houses are timber-framed, their upper stories jutting out above cobbled streets. A lantern sways gently in the evening air. Inside a tavern, merchants speak of trade. In a scriptorium, a printer adjusts his wooden blocks. The air smells of ink and damp wool. England has changed. The medieval world with its feudal bonds, armored knights, and sacred orders begins to yield to something more modern. But its memory endures in stone churches, in courtly language, in the rituals of crown and parliament. The Tudor sun has risen, but the night of medieval England still lingers, soft as velvet, across the hills and cloisters. The century turns again, and with it, the crown begins to wobble. The descendants of Edward III, though many, grow entangled in rival claims and dynastic ambition. Two branches of the royal family emerge as bitter rivals: the House of Lancaster, whose badge is a red rose, and the House of York, whose emblem is white. This conflict becomes known as the Wars of the Roses, a series of civil wars and shifting allegiances that will plunge England into 3 decades of bloodshed, treachery, and political upheaval. The roots lie in the troubled reign of Henry VI, a gentle and devout man, but not suited for kingship. Crowned as a child, Henry grows into a pious and bookish ruler, more drawn to prayer than policy. Under his reign, England loses much of its French territory gained during the 100 Years' War. Discontent rises. His mental health deteriorates. Factions at court sharpen their knives. The Yorkist claim is led by Richard, Duke of York, a powerful noble with a strong line of descent. Though initially a loyal subject, Richard is eventually drawn into open conflict, asserting his right to influence or perhaps even possess the throne. The wars begin in 1455 at the First Battle of St. Albans. Over the next 30 years, England becomes a battlefield of lords. Picture banners fluttering over green fields, heavy armor clashing under gray skies, archers loosing arrows through misty dawns, castles besieged, families divided, victory sways back and forth. At times, it seems the Lancastrians hold the crown firmly. At others, the Yorkists surge forward with unstoppable force. The turning point comes in 1461, when Richard's son, Edward IV, defeats Henry VI and claims the throne. Edward is young, handsome, and militarily capable. For a time, peace returns. But it is fragile. Edward's reign is marred by internal division, particularly with his former ally, Richard Neville, the powerful Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker. When Edward marries Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, against Warwick's wishes, Alliances crack. Warwick turns against Edward, restores Henry VI briefly, then dies in battle. The wheel turns again. Edward returns to the throne, ruling with greater strength until his death in 1483. Here, the shadows grow thicker. Edward's eldest son is still a boy. Edward Vond, the realm must be guided by a protector. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the late king's brother. What follows remains one of the greatest mysteries of English history. Richard takes the crown for himself, becoming Richard III. The young king and his brother, known as the princes in the Tower, vanish within the walls of the Tower of London. Whispers suggest murder, though the truth is never proven. Richard's reign is short, marked by suspicion and unease. And across the sea, a new claimant rises, Henry Tudor, a distant Lancastrian, with a thin but resolute claim. In 1485, he lands in Wales, gathers supporters, and marches to meet Richard in battle. That confrontation comes at Bosworth Field, a quiet rise of land in Leicestershire. On August 22nd, the two armies clash. Richard fights valiantly, charging into the fray in search of Henry himself. But betrayal among his allies seals his fate. Richard falls in battle, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. And with his death, the Plantagenet dynasty ends. Henry is crowned Henry VII, founder of the Tudor dynasty. To unite the warring factions, he marries Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. Red rose and white are joined in a new emblem, the Tudor rose. Thus, the medieval age begins to fade, and something new begins to take form. But before we leave this chapter, let us pause and consider the effects of these civil wars. The power of the great nobles has been broken. Many once powerful houses lie in ruins. Castles are abandoned. Armies shrink. The monarchy, once dependent on noble goodwill, now stands more centralized, more cautious, more commanding. Economically, the wars have limited impact on the peasantry compared to plague or taxation. Fields are still tilled. Markets still operate. Life in villages continues, even as kings rise and fall. Culturally, the late 15th century sees a quiet flowering. Architecture continues to evolve. The perpendicular Gothic style reaches its zenith vertical lines, grand windows, intricate tracery. Universities in Oxford and Cambridge expand. Printing presses soon arrive, spreading books beyond the cloister and court. The Tudors bring order but also vigilance. Henry VII rules shrewdly, restoring the treasury, balancing power, and avoiding reckless wars. His court is subdued but stable. It is the beginning of a new kind of monarchyless feudal, more bureaucratic. As we close this chapter, let us walk through a quiet lane of Tudor London. The houses are timber-framed, their upper stories jutting out above cobbled streets. A lantern sways gently in the evening air. Inside a tavern, merchants speak of trade. In a scriptorium, a printer adjusts his wooden blocks. The air smells of ink and damp wool. England has changed. The medieval world with its feudal bonds, armored knights, and sacred orders begins to yield to something more modern. But its memory endures in stone churches, in courtly language, in the rituals of crown and parliament. The Tudor sun has risen, but the night of medieval England still lingers, soft as velvet across the hills and cloisters.